I don't know if you guys have noticed, but I'm a bit of a superhero fan. One of my favorite superheroes is Batman, and this makes me very unique. You might be saying, wait, who even is that? I've never heard of this guy. Well, let me explain to you who he is. Basically, he's a dude who dresses up like a bat and then spooks people and fights crime. And I know what you're thinking, sounds like a B-Tech Morbius, but no, trust me guys, Morbius is cool, but this Batman is a real up-and-comer, you'll see. As most of you are probably aware, there's a new Batman game coming out, Gotham Knights, or technically not a Batman game because I think something happened to him. I can't remember exactly what though.
Batman is dead.
Oh, right. That's what it was. Now, I've been on the fence about this thing. I've talked about it before, but every time it pulls me in, I have something new to scratch my chin at. The villains look great, the traversal looks dead, the detective stuff sounds awesome, the combat seems stiff, the story could be amazing, the writing is pretty childish.
Bruce always told me to believe in myself, that I had what it takes. Let's prove him right. This is how Robin wins.
Being dead, then brought back to life. It changed me.
No way. But one thing that I think is an untarnished, unequivocally great decision is making the Court of Owls a centerpiece of this game. They're one of the more recent additions to the Batman lore, but man are they cool. So cool that despite only being half interested in this game, I decided to prepare for it by finally reading the Scott Snyder New 52 Batman run where they were first introduced. And then I read the crossover, and then I read the Talon spin-off, and then I read Robin War, and at a certain point I got all the way to the beginning of DC Metal and thought, it would be nice if somebody was able to compile this information into one location, huh? So that's basically what we're here to do. This is a video game channel, but let's talk about a few comics here. Which comics in particular? Well, I was gonna slam them all on a table for dramatic effect, but half the physical copies I ordered were arriving too late, so I wound up reading them all on DC Infinite, even though I couldn't cancel my orders because they'd already been shipped, which means I basically just bought a bunch of physical books and then wound up reading them online. You say waste of money, I say... Yup, these are all the issues that these videos are gonna cover. That's right, I said these videos. This is a two-parter. I think it's the first time I've done that. I realized halfway through writing this that it was gonna be way too long to cover in one video, so yeah, I've split it in two. Part 1, which is this one, covers the original Court of Owls storyline as it pertains to Batman, and also the Talon spin-off. Both of these give a lot of information on the court, they develop them quite a bit. This is necessary stuff. The next video, which should be out a couple days after this one, will cover the Night of Owls and Robin War crossover events, which involve the Bat family and a few others. That's gonna be pretty key for Gotham Knights specifically since it's Bat family centric. And then that video is also going to have a good handful of Nightwing's run-ins with them because he has a very particular history with the group, so even though he's part of the Bat family, I'm going to dive into his stories a bit deeper. That's not 100% of the court's appearances in the comics, but the rest of them are mainly glorified cameos or catalysts to different events. Throughout this video and the next, I'll be mentioning a couple of things that I think could relate to Gotham Knights directly, bosses or ideas that the game will probably borrow, and at the end of part 2, we'll do a nice little roundup of what could show up there. If you're watching this after the game's already out and the story is revealed, then I guess have fun laughing at everything I got wrong. Anyways, enough of me talking, let's get into, more of me talking, I guess. I don't really do much else, do I? Most of this section is going to be the original Court of Owls storyline with a couple of straggler issues that maybe clear up some details. If you're completely new to the Court of Owls, their whole deal is that they're a secret, powerful society that runs Gotham from the shadows, and a lot of their motives and characteristics are revealed in this run, so that's all you really need to know to start off. The OG story starts with Bruce giving a speech on his initiative to rebuild Gotham, an expensive and expansive project that will shape the city into what he believes it truly can be. At the event, he meets Lincoln March, a mayoral candidate for Gotham, and Lincoln mentions how he'd love to play a part in the project. Bruce gets distracted by Jim Gordon's lips during the conversation. He's trying to read them, not kiss him, by the way, although he was looking there initially, so who knows. And on hearing the case that Jim's murmuring about, he hurriedly sets up a meeting with Lincoln and flies out of the event. The case in question involves the brutal murder of a man with false ID denoting him as Sam Striggs, his real name unknown. Not only was his death suspicious because of his anonymity, but his manner of death was also equal parts sadistic and surgical, with each knife that impaled him steering clear of his major arteries to maximize his suffering, and the tiny knives used to impale him being laced with mercury for steadier flight. Clear signs of a well-trained and remorseless killer. Those same knives were also etched with an owl symbol, and when Detective Harvey Bullock suggests that it might be connected to the old wives' tale about the Court of Owls, Bruce shuts him down before he can even finish the thought. He takes a sample of DNA found underneath the victim's fingernails, which could potentially lead to the killer, and also finds a secret message revealed in flames that reads, "Bruce Wayne will die tomorrow." The first issue ends with Alfred running the DNA found under the fingernails on the Bat computer, with the results coming back as Dick Grayson, aka Nightwing. This revelation would shock the entirety of the Batman comic reading audience for about half an issue before it was explained immediately afterwards. The next issue starts with a short cliffhanger and a flashback to some bat shenanigans, and we're back inspecting the body of our John Doe here. Jim and Batsy learn a lot of important information, including the fact that this man was likely a trainer of some sort and was aware that he was being hunted by someone with even more skill than he had. But the most pertinent piece of info is the discovery of the same Athenian owl symbol that was on the knives being placed inside one of the victim's teeth. Immediately, Jim Gordon starts laying down a sweet-ass verse. Beware the court of owls that watches all the time, ruling Gotham from a shadowed perch behind granite and lime. They watch you at your hearth, they watch you in your bed. Speak not a whispered word of them, or they'll send the Talon for your head. Mama. Batman insists that the court doesn't exist, and he seems very firm in that belief. He ends his call with Jim and has a talk with Nightwing, who explains that he recognizes that John Doe is somebody who grabbed his arm a week back at an event and warned him of some unnamed group that was real, and we're sending him for you, all of you. The fingernail DNA came from a man being ripped away from Dick, pause, and given how Batman already had footage to corroborate that story, he believes him. Bruce leaves for his meeting with Lincoln, who explains that he isn't looking for money or an endorsement, and instead wants to build a more organic relationship with Bruce as he believes in what he's doing. He tells a story about his own mother dying when he was young, hit by a drunk driver with him in the car, and describes how he most vividly remembers little details like the heart-shaped pin that she always wore being left on the ground after her death. Similar to how Bruce always recalls the pearls that his mom was wearing every 3 years whenever he's rebooted. Lincoln starts warning him about some evil that's returned, but before he can finish, him and Bruce are attacked by an assassin. The assassin is unbelievably powerful, cunning, and has done his research. Not only is he able to withstand a lot of force directly to his windpipe, but he knew where to kick Bruce into what should be bulletproof glass to shatter it. Bruce is able to evade his death by using a little secret in the building, but the assassin falls straight down and his body is carted off by the GCPD. Halfway through though, the assassin, who fell off the top floor of a skyscraper, suddenly gets up and commandeers the vehicle. Now we snap back to 1922 when an ancestor of Bruce's named Talon is frantically running down the streets screaming nonsense about the 13th hour, nests, and people being after him. The cops recognize him as the man responsible for most major buildings in Gotham, so they have a little sidebar to figure out what to do, and in that time, Alan drops down a manhole and frickin' dies. Back in the present, Bruce is mulling over something the assassin said to him during the freefall, that he loved killing Waynes, and Alfred notes how his great-great-grandfather Alan Wayne developed an obsession with owls when he grew senile, claiming that they lived in his walls and were hunting him. After a conversation with a hospitalized Lincoln who mentions some signs he's noticed potentially alluding to the court's existence, we get one of my favorite sequences in the entire storyline, where Bruce mentions Alan Wayne's superstitious nature and how he was one of the first men to skip the 13th floor of his buildings. To contain the bad energy of what would be a 13th floor, a space needed to be left between the 12th and 14th. And interlaced with his story of superstition is the mention of how owls are one of the rare birds that don't build their own nests, and instead infiltrate those abandoned by other creatures, invading enemy territory. These concepts converge when Bruce explores the unoccupied 13th floor of over a dozen Wayne buildings, and within each of these is a base for the Court of Owls, with pictures dating back over a century and a half in some cases. All of this time, in the very buildings that Alan Wayne built, Gotham's Secret Service had settled into the enemy's own nest unnoticed. Tell me that isn't cool as hell. Inside of one of the bases is a tripwire that sets off an explosion that Bruce narrowly escapes from. After a swift recovery, Nightwing finds him examining the skull of Alan Wayne and warns him about the obsessive path that he's taking and how it can't be any good, as Bruce continues to analyze the body on his computer. At one point, Nightwing makes a really interesting point about him missing the forest for the trees, a similar analogy to one that Lincoln made, where he described a girl at the orphanage that he was at noticing that the building was in a sinkhole, something that nobody else noticed being so busy putting out daily fires, but would have killed them all within a year if she hadn't pointed it out. It's a good way of explaining why Bruce might have missed the Court of Owls this whole time, that he was more focused on what was immediately in front of him than what could have been happening behind the scenes. Bruce tells him to continue, and so he does, but then he says, "Bitch, I was talking to the computer, shut the hell up, boy." Eventually he reveals that he has looked into the Court of Owls extensively and periodically and always came up with nothing. In fact, it was his first case as a detective, convinced that his parents' death wasn't random and hell-bent on finding out who caused it. He had seen an owl's nest in his attic a week before the attack, and he was sure that the Court of Owls, the one from the old nursery rhyme, had a part to play in the murder of Thomas and Martha Wayne. All of the clues led him to the Harbor House, which he was certain was their hideout, but upon entering it, he found nothing. The door shut behind him and he was locked in there for a full weeks, slipping into a coma by the time he was found. He didn't give up the search after that, he kept looking for the corpse, but it always led to a dead end, and he realized that his emotions had got the better of him, that he was searching for the only thing that made sense, even though there was nothing to make sense of. But even though he thought he'd finally ruled the court out, right now he had to follow up on a lead that he found examining Alan Wayne's corpse. He noted the irony in the fact that his great-great-grandfather had spent his life building up Gotham City only to drown in its sewage, but also that information wasn't entirely accurate. Though his body was decomposed by the time it was found, there were clear signs of him being stabbed repeatedly by tiny blades, not unlike the John Doe from earlier, and as Batman searches the sewers for the strange residue also found on the body, he's ambushed by the same assassin as before and brought down to the Labyrinth. This next issue is probably the pinnacle of the story, not necessarily because of its plot, but because of the execution. We're told that the bat signal's been on for 8 days with no reply, and Jim Gordon and the Bat Family, killer band name by the way, debut album Gotham is Burning, that's a #1 hit for sure, has started to assume the worst. Where's Bruce then, after all this time? Still in the labyrinth that he got dropped into, and at this point I want to make a quick footnote for part 2 of the video where we talk about the ties to Gotham Knights. There's recently been an explosion involving Bruce, and very soon after the Bat Fam has reason to believe that he might have kicked the bucket. Just put a pin in that for later. We join Bruce as he's actively going crazy, sneaking around the shadows before being blasted by a white hot light continuously as he finds his way back to this fountain. He tries not to drink the water, but he's been dehydrated way too long. He laps up a little bit and things instantly get insane. It's very hard to describe what happens effectively in summary form without just saying everything that's going on. It gives off a very similar energy to that Far From Home Mysterio scene if it lasted a few days. Batman's got crazy eyes, he keeps scurrying back into the shadows and is faced with hundreds of pictures of the people that the court has killed. Eventually his own face is added to that collection. He starts hallucinating the court, his attacker, his parents, old and brittle, who eventually unhinge their jaws as owls crawl out of their mouths and attack him. At a certain point, the entire book just starts flipping around, like it's sideways, upside down. It's an absolute fever dream. In one section of the maze, he also finds rows of coffins with pictures on them, one of them open, and if you've really been keeping an eye on Gotham Knights marketing, you'll notice that one of the trailers featured a similar room full of coffins, something that's explained later in this story. After all of the insanity, Batman is stabbed by the assassin, and back in Gotham, the bat signal burns out. I think this issue is really indicative of why the Court of Owls is so interesting and so dangerous. The Joker will try and give somebody one bad day and turn him into a psycho just like him. He'll relentlessly try to torture people mentally, but in obvious ways. The court, on the other hand, has patience. They'll remain in the shadows for centuries. They'll let you drive yourself crazy over the course of a week. They're the most frightening when they're utterly elusive and in your head, and I hope that some of that is preserved in the game and they aren't just hired goons the whole time. Anyways, the next issue we see Batman getting absolutely battered around by this assassin, which by this point you've probably realized is the Talon that the nursery rhyme mentioned, and the person that the John Doe warned Nightwing about. He's really got B-Man on the ropes here. I mean, look at the state of this guy, and as he chucks him around and yells to the sky, revealing an arena of court onlookers that are viewing this almost as a gladiator match, Batman makes a weird mention of the camera in the room being knocked over. The court asks for more brutality before his death, and the Talon obliges, but as the rest of the court swarms in on him, Bruce musters up enough strength to fight for the legacy of his family, generations of his family, and is able to stand and fight. This image is obviously enhanced by the weird drug-inducing Uncharted 3 water that he drank from the fountain earlier, the same one that gave him these other visions, but for the next few panels he continues to be drawn as this ravenous animal version of himself, which also ties into the general theory I have for the backstory of Gotham Knights, but I'll get into that later. He manages to overcome the Talon, who, while skilled, likely wouldn't have beat him on fair terms and was really helped out by the court's psychological torture, and once he manages to pull that off, he declares war on the court and escapes by igniting the filament plates in the camera from earlier near the fountain that was built of white marble, a material susceptible to fire. He ekes out of there into the river and the court looks disappointingly at their Talon. They consider allowing him to continue his duties but ultimately deem him too weak, although they don't care that much since they have plenty more. By the way, I don't usually do this in the middle of a video, but if you are interested in the second part of this series, or you just want to see more of me talking about games, I guess, feel free to subscribe and also check out the Discord, it's in the description. I know this video is more comic focused, but if you are interested in that stuff, then go check it out. Anyways, back to what you care about. So Batman almost dies in the river, he's resuscitated by this chick, she turns into Bluebird, that's a whole other ordeal. And as he recovers from his wounds, the Court of Owls is shown reviving one of their dead Talons somehow and planning for a bigger strike on the city. Bruce is let into the Batcave by Alfred and finds the Talon that he knocked out all strapped up, immediately freaking out. Now me personally, I would never let a grown-ass man see me like this, but that's just me. But as it turns out, the Talon's dead, found in the river and brought in by Alfred for examination. Good old Dick lives up to his name and refuses to leave Batman alone, and he's given the lowdown on the state of the Talon. Bruce explains that he's simultaneously alive and dead, that the court was able to specifically prepare bodies in a way that would allow for them to be reanimated. Likening it to the tradition of ancient Greeks placing a coin behind a corpse's tongue to pay Charon for a safe passage through Hades, essentially the Talon was given a deposit of electrum through a little owl-shaped deposit in his tooth like the one found on the John Doe, and that seeped into his blood and his cells, turning him into a walking conductor that when retired could be reanimated through a little spark that would essentially charge the cells in his body after death, keeping him functioning. That explains why he was able to heal after his massive fall. His cells just continually regenerate because of this ritual. The counter to this is extreme cold, as the process needs heat in order to operate, which is why the freezing river was able to debilitate the Talon and why Bruce was able to keep him from coming back to life. If you're wondering, by the way, if all of this is possible in real life, what are you, 5? Of course not, but damn if it isn't a cool way to explain the undead. It's at this point that we learn something very important to the story of Dick Grayson, something that I have to assume will play a huge part in Gotham Knights, but as big as it is, I think it's best to leave it for the Nightwing section in part 2 so we can just jump into a story from there. After their conversation ends, we go back to the perspective of the court as they launch an attack to take back Gotham, and we see that they haven't just reanimated one Talon, but all of them. Every Talon that they've managed to recruit over the years now sent out at once to wreak havoc on the city. It's not long into Bruce's recovery when the attack reaches him, as the Talons invade Wayne Manor and the Batcave. Most of this part is just action, your standard roof hopping, flying kicks, and giant penny slams as dozens of Talons flood in, forcing Bruce and Alfred to take refuge. Bruce calls for the temperature in the Batcave to be brought to sub-zero, but knowing that they won't be safe in this room for long, he goes out to face the Talons in a giant militarized bat suit. He can take off the kitty gloves now that he knows that the Talons are already dead, and he does his best to hold his own, but while he's fighting, Alfred notifies him that he's found a list from the court of all the major figures in Gotham. A hit list for this night including the comptroller, the deputy sheriff, Supreme Court justice, city council members, and one by one we see each member getting taken out by the owls. Commissioner Gordon, the mayor, and Bruce are also on the list, and it's clear that while Bruce can maybe come out on top in the fight in Wayne Manor, he's gonna need a lot of help to stave off the attack on Gotham as a whole. Alfred puts out a call to action for the entire Bat family, and this begins the Night of Owls crossover, which is also reserved for the next video. You'll see how the Bat family comes into the fold and all of this, but for now let's focus on the conclusion of Bruce Wayne's story. He fights his way out of the Batcave by freezing Talon, setting a giant mechanical T-Rex on him, being saved by actual bats. It's a whole thing. And as the Bat family handles the other assassination targets, Batman goes for Dr. Arkham and then Lincoln March. There's a whole issue in another series that covers the Dr. Arkham rescue. It's not really worth covering in this video because even though it's related, the most we see of the actual Court of Owls is them being attacked in the asylum and getting ganged up on. At one point, Black Mask tries to invade Batman's head, but I guess Wong told him to fortify your mind, because he just firms it, and that's really all you need to know. And back in the main series, Batman makes it just in time to see the assassination and retaliation of Lincoln March, as March manages to fire back at a Talon while bleeding out himself. As he bleeds out, he hands Batman a list to give Bruce Wayne of names he believes are related to the court. We're also given the first part of a message that Alfred's father had left him, which was never delivered, where he outlines a horrible car crash at the hands of a Talon back when Martha and Thomas were still alive. Bruce uses the list to track down the Talons who, as it turns out, did in fact operate out of the house he discovered as a child, only this time when he walks back into the room, he doesn't find dust, but instead 23 members of the Court of Owls all gathered around the table, dead. It appears to be a mass suicide, perhaps a sacrifice to preserve the anonymity of the remainder of the court now that a section had been found out, but on mulling it over in his house, Bruce notices something in the picture of his mother and realizes who he should have been going after this entire time. He visits the Willowwood Home for Children, a building standing on a sinkhole, just like the story that Lincoln March had told him. He finds Lincoln there, undead in the same way that the Talons are, having put himself through the same process, and they have a bit of a rigmarole here where Bruce connects all the dots. Lincoln March was made up by the Court of Owls. The man in front of him was an inmate here taken in by the court, and as he pulls out a new suit that the court began designing to counter Batman, Bruce mentions the clues Lincoln often dropped that would lead him to this place as if on purpose. Not just the story of the sinkhole, but more importantly, the heart-shaped pin that he described earlier, apparently belonging to his mother, the same pin sometimes worn by Martha Wayne. Things kinda get crazy here. We get the revelation that Lincoln is essentially betraying the court after seeing how they accidentally attacked him during the original hit on Wayne way back 15 minutes ago in this video. He killed the members at that table himself, and the big twist, he's Bruce's younger brother, born prematurely during the car crash that Martha got into years ago, presumed dead but secretly placed in a home for children with neurological disorders by Bruce's parents to see if he would get better. Now I didn't like this twist at first because I was like, really? The secret brother this whole time thing? We're actually doing this? Alright, but they actually handle it pretty well by leaving it pretty open-ended. Essentially, Bruce and Lincoln duke it out. This part's kinda cool but not really relevant to the plot points we gotta cover. Lincoln is blown up in a building and we get Bruce explaining to Nightwing why Lincoln's story was likely entirely fabricated. fabricated. Martha Wayne did have her baby prematurely during the car crash, but he died 12 hours later. There were no signs that his death had been falsified, although another baby, yet another John Doe, was placed in Willowwood a week later. Bruce believes that the timing and Martha's frequent visits to the facility, something that she did with all of the charities she funded, were enough to convince Lincoln of the story when the court presented him with it. In the end, he can't be sure what happened, just what's most likely, and he's able to close the book on the idea by deciding to have faith that his parents wouldn't send their own son to a correctional facility and cover it up. We get a final passage of Alfred's father, Jarvis, recounting the story of threats being sent to Martha as she set up plans to better the city, similar to what Bruce was doing at the beginning of this story, and how the family refused to back down, resulting in the crash and the loss of the child. The parallels between Martha's public plans to change the city and Bruce's seem intentional, as the Court of Owls proclaims itself as the Grey of Gotham, not allowing it to fall into complete despair if they can stop it in order to have control and power, but also not allowing it to achieve greatness so that it slips from their fingers, meaning any large-scale betterment plan needs to be cut off at the knees. That also explains why the first Wayne they tortured was Alan, whose work built Gotham from the ground up. Jarvis mentions that the boy was buried on Wayne grounds, but he once caught Martha speaking about him as if he was still alive. Whether out of grief or honesty, it's never made clear. Before he manages to get the letter to his son, Jarvis Pennyworth is murdered and burned by the Court of Owls, and that brings to a close the original and most crucial Court of Owls storyline. I'm on the fence about whether Lincoln March, potential brother of Bruce Wayne, will find his way to the Gotham Knights story, but I could see some of these concepts being used. For example, a likable leader secretly working for the Court of Owls who undergoes a similar process to the Talons and faces the family as one of the final bosses. I'd be suspicious about any charismatic leaders is all I'm saying. A few issues involving Batman solo show up later, including one where Lincoln March comes back, not hard to believe because he's undead, and they pop their head into some events, but their major roles after this come mainly in the Nightwing stories, the two crossovers I mentioned earlier, and the Talon storyline. So before we close off this video, let's take a quick peek at that last one. This section is going to be way shorter, and I'm not going to be recapping the entire story. I think I needed to in that last section because it's the most popular Court of Owls storyline, but here I just want to go over some major characters and a couple of small developments in the court. First character, Calvin Rose. This is the main character of this series. He was recruited from the same circus that all the Talons were, as the court wanted acrobats for their assassins. But he was an escape artist, which was a bit of a different angle for the collective. He's put under their service, but when his first mission is to kill off the bloodline of a paranoid tech mogul, a bloodline that includes a 2-year-old girl, he saves them instead and decides to go on the run. The court is constantly on his heels, but after he hears of the Night of Owls where many Talons were killed or locked up, he believes that the court may have disappeared. Realizing pretty quickly that they haven't, he's recruited by Sebastian Clark, a man with a lot of inside info on the Court of Owls from his father's tell-all book that he was killed for, never making it to the public. Sebastian has Calvin running missions for him, including stealing away the Grandmaster's mask from the current holder, and convinces him that this will finish the court once and for all. Partway through the series, Calvin gets his neck snapped by Bane, but because of the tooth implant, he comes back to life and continues fighting against the court. Again, make a footnote here. He has a couple of run-ins with Batman, who isn't very fond of him. Batman also shows up in the climax, demanding a court member reveal the whereabouts of Lincoln March once it's revealed that he's still alive, and eventually he's taken in by Batman Incorporated. I don't expect Calvin to show up in the main game, but he could make for a really interesting short DLC character, kind of like how Arkham Knight had the short Harley and Red Hood sections, and his character is important in signifying that Talons aren't mindless killers or under complete control of the Owls. They've been indoctrinated and will likely do whatever the court asks them to, but they do have a level of autonomy. Mary Turner is another Talon that undergoes the same shift away from the court, so fingers crossed the Talons in this game aren't brainless killing machines, because they could be a lot more. Next we have Sebastian Clark. This is the man who recruited Calvin for what we find out later is his own devious motives, as it's revealed that he's actually an ex-court grandmaster. Not just any grandmaster, but the one in charge during the night of the Court of Owls, and the one who colluded with Lincoln March against the court. He's basically just using Calvin to seep away their control and take it for himself. He teams up with Bane for a short period, which leads to the next snap. He eventually kills the current grandmaster, John Wycliffe, and tries to blow up Gotham. Very inspired plan. Haven't seen anyone try that before. He fails and winds up being the member who's interrogated by Batman, like I mentioned, and once again, I don't think he'll show up in Knights, but I do think if they decide to turn this into a franchise with the Court of Owls as the major through line, kind of like Joker was in the Arkham trilogy, these kinds of stories with betrayal and redistribution of power are likely to pop up. A character that I do think will find its way into Gotham Knights is the Gotham Butcher. This was a massive Talon the court once had under its service, whose bloodlust would often lead to more casualties than were planned, risking attention being drawn to their work. He killed hundreds of people during his run as a Talon, most unassigned, and was locked away in a high security area as a result. With Batman and Talon's 1-2 punch causing real problems for the court, they decided to reanimate him as a Hail Mary, implanting cryobombs in his head as a failsafe in case he goes rogue again, which he later digs out from behind his eye. He's absolutely brutal and massive, and given that Knights already has talents to spare and looks like it's trying to keep the focus away from bigger villains like Joker and Two-Face and more on ones like Harley, Penguin, and Clayface, I think the Gotham Butcher would be a nice stand-in for Bane. He might be a main boss in the immediate storyline, or he might go off and do his own thing since his allegiance is to murder, not his master's. I think he'd be a great boss selection, and we already know that most Talons aren't really boss fights in this game. We can see this Talon Gladiator is just a regular tough enemy, for example, so it would fill in that gap of a big imposing force in front of the family. There's also Wolf Spider, which, I mean, we're just running out of names, aren't we? He's not really in the series much, but he's a sprinter who's injected with venom after his muscles were ripped apart and brought back together, so he's fast and lanky. That's another potential boss I could see show up. And the rest of the story I think I'll leave here because it doesn't have much to do with the court or its lore. Maybe a couple of interesting tidbits like the tortured son of a member who built the safe haven being enlisted as a Talon by his spiteful father and eventually being encased by the metal of the building he swore to protect. Stuff like that, it's interesting, but the rest is largely just non-essential stuff that follows a side character. Everything that's left now involves the Bat family either as a whole or just Nightwing on his own, and even though it's not as popular as this original story, it still gives a lot of important insights into the court. That second video should be up in a couple of days, and if you're watching this a few days after it releases, then it's already out. I think that's how time works. Check out part 2, subscribe if you're new here. Again, I don't really talk about comics all that much, but if you like video games, then this is the place to be. Check out the Discord, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.